So, as I said, the thing that I'm going to talk about is rather sad, but I think it's important, and I think there's actually, I hope that I can offer something hopeful for us as a community as well. And it may seem strange to bring it up, but it's something that impacts us all. If you knew that there was a certain group in society that is less likely to complete any level of education, more likely to commit suicide, more likely to end up in prison, less likely to live independently, more likely to abuse drugs and alcohol, more likely to engage in violence, and more likely to die violently. If you knew all of that, wouldn't you want to do something to help? You might even take to the streets in protest and demand that something be done. And I think that would probably be the right thing to do. There is such a group in our country and in at least 63 developed countries worldwide, and it's boys. Yeah, boys and young men. So when expecting parents are asked if they prefer what they prefer their coming child to be, fathers are now twice as likely to say that they hope for a girl, and mothers are 24% more likely to hope for a girl as well. Why? The answer is very slightly, of course, but they share a common theme. In the society we live in, it seems that it is apparently better to grow up as a girl than as a boy. What's going on? In 2010, The Atlantic published an article entitled "The End of Men." And the article was so popular that it was later expanded into a book. The gist of it was this. Back in rough times in history, men were, pretty handy, and they played a role in conquest and settling, and therefore they also had all the power, which they usually abused. But modern society, with its civilization and comfort, doesn't need that kind of critter. Imagine, says the author of this book, The Boy Crisis, which I recommend to you. There are several others that I would recommend, but I think this is a good place to start for the kind of thing that I'm talking about today. The Boy Crisis by Warren Farrell and John Gray. And Gray challenges, he offers that information, right? He recalls that article was written, and he challenges you to think, like, can you imagine somebody writing and titling an article today, "The End of Women," and meaning it? There could be. I kind of doubt it. I kind of doubt that it would get the same sort of traction. Is it any wonder that boys are in decline in every key metric of success and fulfillment, and on the rise in every detrimental and deadly category? Just to bring up a few categories. Suicide, unfortunately. Before puberty, suicide rates between the sexes are equal. However, between ages 10 and 14, boys commit suicide at twice the rate that girls do. And all told, boys and men commit suicide 3.5 times more often than girls and women. Incarceration. The prison population increased more than 700% between 1973 and 2013. Of that population, 93% are men and disproportionately young. Education. Boys are less likely to complete high school, less likely to complete college, less likely to pursue any advanced degree. In 1965, 61% of college degrees were earned by men, where 39% were earned by women. As of today, those numbers are exactly reversed. And here's the funny thing. The point at which they evened out was longer ago than you might expect. It was in 1981, about 15 years after there was that disproportionate where men were awarded more college degrees. For the last 40 years, the majority of college degrees have been earned by women. Now, I'm going to make a brief caveat here, lest anyone worry too much. it is very good that more women have gone to college than in previous generations, right? I am all for that. The increase in education, job acquirement, job satisfaction, all of these things that have increased for women are very good, right? The unfortunate thing is that simultaneously, they haven't just maintained for men. They have dramatically decreased. So that's why I think it's worth considering what's going on. Because if we had just realized, like, oh my goodness, we have been mistreating women, let's fix that. And then we fixed it, and everyone was like, whew, succeeding and satisfied and happy and fulfilled. That would be great. That would mean we had succeeded in addressing the problem we noticed in like the 50s and the 60s especially, and then moving on. We righted one side of the equation, and we started failing on the other side in a big way. Jobs, this is very interesting. There are only 3 cities in the whole country where men under 30 earn as much or more than their female peers. Men are also more likely to be unemployed, which in turn makes it harder to find a partner, since 3 out of 4 women say they would not date an unemployed man, whereas 2 out of 3 men say dating an unemployed woman is a non-issue. Men under 30 are also more likely to live with their parents than their female peers, which again is citing a relational problem from the perspective of women. Yes. But it's again, like if you reverse it, it's a non-issue for men typically. Like if they happen to meet someone who is still living with her parents, that's not seen as a barrier. Whereas from the woman's perspective, if she finds out that the man, and there are lots of sad anecdotes in the book about guys being out on dates and finally having to reveal that information, and the night just ending, right? Whereas, a few moments ago, things had seemed so promising. So, what's the problem? Isn't it the case that under different societal conditions, one sex is more likely to succeed than the other, and now it's just women's turn? I have a friend who shall remain nameless, because they're definitely not in this room, who sometimes when I talk about this sort of thing likes to quote a line from Parks and Rec at me. There's this moment where, Leslie Knope is running for office, and these, group of sad little men are like protesting because they don't want a woman to be their senator. And she's like, what is your problem? And one of them is like, well, we men have had it hard for a little while now. So sure. There is that kind of thing going on in some hearts as well. But no, in The Boy Crisis, Farrell and Gray argue convincingly, I think, that when only one sex wins, both sexes actually lose. When women suffer, men will suffer, and vice versa. And right now, as we can see from the data, men are suffering. But it isn't because of a loss of civil rights per se, or some other cause that might closely resemble the oppression of women or other minorities in the past. It is because the very idea of manhood has been gutted and diminished. Boys perceive that not only is there nothing inherently good, this is what they, I think, hear around them. There is nothing inherently good about being a man. And a purpose void like that is hard enough to navigate, right? If you think to yourself, well, there's nothing really good about what I am, right? Maybe other people. That's hard enough. But they also know that they are thought of as dangerous and chaotic and disappointing and toxic. And here's where this leads. It won't go away. It will only get worse generations from now if nothing changes. Some men will become diminished, maybe assume a lower place in society. And some men will become increasingly alienated, isolated, and angry. And men who feel degraded and wronged won't disappear. they will go one of two ways. They will either, apparently, injure themselves, or they will seek others to injure. Now for something hopeful. Gray says, the great law of the Iroquois is that our most sacred duty is to think 7 generations ahead of any decision. To be aware of whether the decisions we are making today will benefit not just ourselves and our children, but our children's children several generations into the future. And I love this idea. I think what comes to mind naturally when you think of something like that, like how can I benefit 7 generations in the future? We think of money, we think of property, we think of other possessions, we might think of education in some way. And I think as a community and as a country, if we are to think 7 generations ahead, we must invest in the health and virtue of men and women. And right now I think that means a concerted effort towards the health, virtue, and purpose of our boys and young men. I like to think of an easy way to identify this as making versus using. Men in crisis use. Probably humans in crisis use, but this is what I'm thinking of right now. Men in crisis use. What do they use? Women when they can, pornography, alcohol, drugs, violence. But healthy men make things. And what do they make? They make cities and cathedrals and families and art, airplanes. How do we help boys become men who are makers rather than users? And something I love about the idea of maker is that in Greek, the word poietas is the word for making. But if you heard it, you know that it's the root of what became our word for poetry. And so there's something inherently poetic about making things because it requires inner life and creativity and health, but also a vision for something good that you want to make, not something that you want to use. So, how do we help boys become men who are makers rather than users? A couple of things that are just general wisdom from the book that I'm going to say out loud because they help me sort of orient myself. Part of why I get choked up with thinking about this is because, for one thing, I'm a teacher, so I probably would have gotten choked up with this talk anyway, because I love the boys and girls at the school. But I've got, a 5-year-old girl, a 3-year-old boy, and a 4-month-old girl. And I think about the world that each of them is going to grow up in. And part of that is really terrifying, as all of you know. And part of it means that I need to summon up the fortitude to teach them fortitude. And I need to teach them how to be the kinds of men and women who will be makers rather than users and who will establish cities and communities. Thinking particularly of little boys. Little boys need their dads. Even in separated couples, presence with the dad turns out to be tremendously important. Dads are good for a couple of things that are just kind of unique. And this doesn't come from me. This comes from the studies that Gray and Farrell have done. Boundaries are really different with fathers than with mothers. Yeah, okay. But it's the kind of thing where I feel like if I just say it, might be dangerous. I don't know. But then things that maybe I don't have to hedge about. Rough housing. Rough housing turns out to be so important. On up through youth. But also the teaching of various life skills, right? You don't have to be Joe Outdoorsman to think to yourself okay, what are the things that I sort of take for granted that I know basically how to do? When's the right time to be all right, Charlie, you're going to learn how to do this right now. and sit through it, and it's going to take 5 times as long as it normally would, and that's the right thing to do. Middle school and up, or sort of late elementary and middle school up, they still need their dads, of course, but they now also definitely need a community that includes peers and older men. So it actually helps if those older men are not all the same age. They need their peers. They need the basketball team that they would love to be on. They need their class. They also need a younger teacher. They need an older teacher. They need a community of men of different ages, different skills, different backgrounds. They need close, physically expressive friendships. And this is maybe like harder for Americans to engage with. Dr. Anthony Bradley, who I don't know if anyone is familiar with him, but he's a theologian and philosopher of religion who works at the King's College in New York City. His main academic work can be found in a book entitled Overcriminalization and Incarceration in America. And he's fantastic. He's also, like, if you want to follow him on Twitter or something, he's a bit of a firebrand, and I never know what he's going to say, but he constantly challenges me to think about what I'm comfortable with. He is right now focusing on a study of fraternities and why young men in America are so drawn to fraternities. And it turns out that in a society where, we're really worried if young men are like physically affectionate with each other, young men actually really need that. And that's to bring it back to sports. That's another thing that sports do, right? Like the guys on the team, you end up like really like smashing up against each other, of course, but you also hug each other a lot more. You pat each other on the back a lot more, on the butt, whatever. And yeah, good game. And that turns out to be really important. But it's something that we are frequently uncomfortable with. And they need to be challenged. They don't need to be told, you have all kinds of advantages because you're a man. They need to be challenged. They need community. And in something that Dr. Bradley calls heroic masculinity, the pinnacle of that is sacrificial giving. Now, this is an area of the book where I might differ with Farrell and Gray. One of the conclusions that they come to is that, okay, so what we need to do is disabuse society and boys of something we're going to call heroic intelligence. It's the thing that makes men throw themselves into battle. It's the thing that makes, boys playing football who have had multiple concussions throw themselves into a tackle again, right? We need to get rid of that. And we need to implant health intelligence, says Mr. Yee. I would like to suggest that maybe there's a vision where heroic intelligence and health intelligence could cohere. And sacrificial giving is a very important way to think of that, right? Because sacrificial giving, of course, you could term the boy on the football line as like sacrificially giving his body for the game and for his team, but that's not quite what sacrificial giving means. So in order to think about how these two might be brought together, I want to reach a little bit further back to an essay by C.S. Lewis called The Necessity of Chivalry. And this is an essay where Lewis says, hey, remember the thing in, the medieval period that gave rise to courtly love? Chivalry, right? Lewis doesn't ever argue that we need to bring back exactly what was in place during that time. Because again, let's remember, and he actually points this out, one of the reasons that it was flawed, like it had something, it's a beautiful, beautiful thing that I hope to describe for you in just a moment. but it was flawed somewhere in there because it was in place at a time where women were still considered property, right? There was something rotten at the heart of something that had been otherwise very beautifully and courageously designed. So what does Lewis think it is? He harkens back to a passage from Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, the Death of King Arthur, where Sir Ector says to Sir Lancelot, "Thou wert the fiercest among foes in the field, and the meekest in the hall among ladies." And he means this as like a great honor to Lancelot, at which Lancelot breaks down crying, because of course he did. There wasn't really shame about crying in the medieval period, which is interesting. So, thou wert the fiercest among foes in the field, and the meekest in the hall among ladies. When I was little, I thought the word meek meant weak. And so I thought when I heard the meek shall inherit the earth, I was like, well, I guess I won't inherit the earth because I don't want to be weak. I was really concerned about, I don't know. I know. What's wrong with me? But meekness is, of course, not weakness. Meekness is the intentional surrender of one's power in deference to those around you, right? So, it's appropriate to be fierce in the field, and it's even more appropriate to intentionally surrender that fierceness, that power that belongs in this domain over here. There's actually a place where it's fitting to surrender it here and say, I have to change myself to this setting, right? And Lewis thinks that there's actually something really good about this for men, and for especially young men to learn, because it requires them to make a work of art of themselves. And here's what he means by that. There are some men who are just very naturally fierce on the field, and there are some men who are probably very naturally meek in the hall. And what chivalry demands is that you learn the other side, the side that you're not naturally inclined to or gifted at. And that is a very challenging and tremendously uncomfortable process to undergo, because you don't just get to be the jock or the theater kid in that context. You actually have to make a whole man of yourself and strive to be someone who could operate in either context. And that's really hard. But Lewis thinks that it's the only way to get the people who are naturally meek in the hall to sort of step up a bit and be someone who could jump into the fray if needed. And he says, more importantly, perhaps, it is the only way to keep the people who are naturally fierce in the field, to give them a challenge and a motivation to actually move away from some of those tendencies that could make them wolves in the end, that could let them totally rest in fierceness and anger and rage. They are called to come together with the other side. And that challenge should be something that calls up the man in the heart of either side. So that's a positive vision for the kind of thing that we might need. And Lewis says, look, we can't go back to all of the courtly ideals because, look, there were these flaws, and you never get to go back anyway. Let's say we all wanted to live, I don't know, you could pick a period, 16th century Bohemia, but I'm not sure why you would want to do that. Prague would be lovely. But we couldn't anyway, right? And we wouldn't belong there. We think to ourselves with, a sense of nostalgia, that if only I could get to X, then I'd be happy or I'd do things right. But Lewis says that the way to happiness is forward. And so whatever the vision is, we've given the vision, whatever the way that it needs to play out is for our boys in 2022 and following, it's not going to look exactly like Hector talking to Lancelot. But the spirit of the thing will be there. And we will need them to possess both sides, to work towards both sides, I should say. And we should learn to praise both sides and spur them on to the one that isn't their natural strength when we can. We're working on this at the school right now. As Mr. Yee mentioned, I think we had man night and woman night for the first time this year. And the 5th and 6th grade etiquette ball. Right, which we ultimately need an etiquette ball that's like the senior etiquette ball, right? With so many forks. Yeah, and dancing is probably really important. So this is something that we're working on, but it has to be a community effort. We are thinking really hard about it. We've been having gender and culture meetings for years at this point, trying to think about how we can grapple with some of these issues. But it needs to be something that we as a community are bought into. And that doesn't mean, by the way, that everyone has to agree with everything I've said or with C.S. Lewis, but at least in identifying, the crisis is real. Farrell and Gray point out that it is a strangely invisible crisis. It's not one that gets much airtime, and it's not one that we're even, like, people with children, people with sons, are surprised to hear lots of those numbers. I know I was. I was like, I didn't think it was that, like, disproportional, but it is. And that's recent, as in the last 5 decades especially. And if there is a group that is suffering, then we should help. And I think we can. You can in your own homes. Your churches can. Our churches are frequently not thinking of this. And we can at the school. So we need your help.